Me clearly and see my slides?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Ivan.
Hey, hold on, I'm just putting a timer on to make sure I stick to the 10 minutes.
Self-policing,
Okay.
like.
Sorry, Paul, I missed that.
Self-policing, I like. Anyway, I'll let you get on. I'm affecting your timings.
It's a real pleasure to be with you. And first of all, I'm going to embarrass Jonathan Sharples. Jonathan Sharples lectured me in 2001, and he was by far my favorite lecturer. So it's a real privilege 21 years later to be sort of sharing a presentation slot with him. I don't think I've ever told Jonathan what a good lecturer he was. But anyway, coastal flooding. So yep, I led this report card, but I had a huge amount of help from Uwe, Jenny, Charlotte, Robert, Edmund, and Paul. So a big thank you to them. Now, when it comes to coastal flooding, I like to, we tend to fixate on climate change, which I think is obviously very, very important. But I always like to remind people that coastal flooding is nothing new. As long as people have lived on the coast, we have experienced coastal flooding. If you go back 1,000 years in the UK, we had an extremely big event in 1099, which is estimated killed up to 100,000 people around the North Sea coastline. In 1607, 2,000 people were killed in and around the Bristol Channel. That remains one of the biggest events to affect the UK in the last 600 years. And obviously more recently, 1953 was the benchmark flood, which killed 300 people in the UK, about 1,500 people across the Netherlands. We've come a long way. In 2013, we had a very similar event, but thankfully no one died because of significant improvements in flood defences and warning. Now, just to take you a whistle stop through coastal flooding, it's important to understand the different components of coastal flooding. So we tend to think about the source. So the source is the water. It's the origin of the hazards, the extreme sea levels made up of tides, storm surges, waves, superimposed on a mean sea level. Now, there isn't going to be any flooding unless that water makes its way onto dry land. So the pathway is the route that water takes to get onto land and how it's influenced on the way. That could be overflow, overtopping, or breaching. And then finally, the receptor and the consequences. The receptors are, well, what's flooded? Is it people? Is it assets? Is it the environment, agricultural land? The consequences are then, what is the social, economic, environmental damage that occurs? And what we did in our report card was we structured it around this source pathway receptor consequence that Paul Sayers introduced in 2002 for flooding. And I'm going to go through each of these three components very quickly, first for the past, then for the future. So let's start with the past source. Well, sea levels at any point in time are made up of mean sea level, that's the red line there, a kind of average level of the sea. Tides then rise and fall above that. We then have the storm surge and wave components on top of that. Well, it's important to think how extreme sea levels can change. Well, firstly, just in a direct sense, as sea levels rise without any changes in weather or anything, it can just push the water levels up to a point where you start to get flooding. However, as sea levels rise, it can change the way tides and storm surges and waves propagate. So you can have waves breaking near to the coast, but then also you can get increases in weather, more storm surges, more waves that also affect coastal flooding. Now, what we find is that there's absolutely no doubt whatsoever that extreme sea levels have become more and more frequent over the last 150 years. And what you can see is on the left panel, we're plotting Newlyn, the longest tide gauge record in the world, goes back to in the UK, goes back to 1911. And I've just picked different thresholds. So the red one at the top is the 1% of exceedances. And what you can see is no matter what level you pick, extreme sea levels have statistically significantly increased over time. But if we extract mean sea level, and that's the plot on the right, a lot of those trends disappear. So what it shows us is extreme sea levels are getting more frequent, but almost primarily that is due to sea level rise. We see very little evidence for a significant increase in storminess affecting storm surges over the 20th century. Most of that change is mean sea level. Now, at the same time, our pathways are changing, both in a negative but also a positive sense. In a negative sense, with sea level rise and coastal squeeze, we are seeing a decline in salt marshes, shingle beaches and sand dunes, which act as a natural buffer. So this is also, in addition to sea level rise, increasing coastal flooding. However, at the same time, if you look at the bottom right plot, we have built, over the last 50 years, we've built huge flood defences. We've introduced forecasting service, which has slightly reduced the impact of flooding. So it's a bit of a contrary picture there. Now, in terms of the receptors and consequences, well, I've been through our SurgeWatch database, been monitoring sort of 15 different social, economic and environmental consequences of flooding. So loss of life, flooding of residential property, does it affect energy, transport, etc. Now, it's important to note that these receptors are often affect much wider areas than just the flood through disruptions in supply chains. And also, for example, if you take mental health, the impacts can be long lasting. People can suffer from mental health for 3 years after a flood. Now, what we find is that actually flood risk itself has increased, mainly driven by an increase in coastal populations. There's so many more people and development in the floodplains. And for example, the National Trust study showed that there's at least 15,000 new properties being built in areas that are subject to flooding and erosion. But actually, when we statistically analyze the database of coastal flooding that we've collected over the last 100 years, we actually see a slight reduction in coastal flooding itself. Even though extreme sea levels have gone up, the impacts of flooding have actually gone down slightly because we've built defences a lot over the last 50 years, and because we've had huge improvements in flood forecasting, but also spatial planning and building codes. So let's now think about the future. Well, it's virtually certain that extreme sea levels will increase and increase even more significantly over the 21st century and beyond, driven primarily by the fact that sea levels are accelerating. We had 2 millimeters per year mean sea level rise over the 20th century. That's increased to about 5 millimeters per year now. And on the top, you can just see a range of different sea level projections for London and Cardiff as an example for different RCP scenarios, but we're likely to get at least up to a metre of sea level rise by 2100. We are committed to a metre of sea level rise. It's just whether it happens this century or next. On the bottom plot, you can see just a projection for the whole of the UK. This is the RCP 8.5. Projections tend to be slightly higher in the south coast, lower in Scotland because of the sort of influence of vertical land movements. There still is lower confidence, and I'm sure, Lucy, I saw you in the audience, could talk about this, but we have lower confidence regarding changes in storminess. We don't know, we're still not very clear about the extent to which we'll see more storm surges and more waves. So that's still an area of medium to low confidence, but we know very high confidence that extreme sea levels will increase as a result of mean sea level. In terms of pathways, we know that the natural buffers, salt marshes, shingle beaches, sand dunes, will continue to decrease with coastal squeeze and sea level rise, and this will put dramatic pressure on our defences and require us to invest a lot more money in maintaining our existing defences, let alone building new ones. Paul Sayers has done some really nice work, and he showed this plot here that as sea levels rise, that the length of defences that will become very highly vulnerable will increase massively. With 0.5 meters of sea level rise, we're likely to double the length of coastline, which will be highly vulnerable to sea level rise. The number of properties behind that will increase by about 160%. With a much more extreme, but still physically plausible, very unlikely sea level of 2.5 meters, the number of vulnerable defences will triple, the number of properties will increase to about 500%. In terms of receptors and consequences, please have a look at Paul Sayers' report here for the Committee on Climate Change, but by 2080s, assuming current adaptation levels, we predict that annual flood damages will increase by at least 2 to 3-fold, depending on your temperature, population growth, from about £360 million of annual damages today. So a significant increase. At least 1,600 kilometres of roads, 650 kilometres of railway, 92 railway stations, 54 historic landfill sites are likely to be at increased risk of coastal flooding or erosion by the end of the century. And unfortunately, it's going to be the vulnerable communities that are disproportionately affected, widening inequalities. So just finally, and Paul, I am sticking to time. In terms of what is already happening, we have high confidence. We know for certain that extreme sea levels have increased in frequency. We know that we've been able to manage that relatively well up to this point with improvements in flood defences and warning. In terms of the future, we have very, very high confidence that mean sea levels are rising, but we have lower confidence in how the pathways will change, and also much lower confidence in whether storminess will further enhance that. Thank you, Paul. Back to you.